Hi everyone, in this screencast we're going to talk about Chapter 10 from your AIS textbook, E-Business in Enterprise Resource Planning Systems. Our objectives for Chapter 10, explain the nature of e-business, comparing and contrasting it with kind of our traditional brick and mortar organizations. We'll talk a little bit about the major forms of e-business, including business to business, consumer to consumer, government to business, and government to consumer. We'll talk about the basic nature, kind of the general purpose, and then the structure of our ERP systems. We'll give just a few examples of common causes of ERP system failures and look a little bit in depth about success factors that contribute to successful implementations. And then we'll discuss the role of application service providers, ASPs for short, in e-business. E-business for our purpose is going to be any business that's transacted over the internet or any other computer network for that matter. So this could be something as simple as you paying with a debit card at Harris Teeter to companies passing order and vendor information back and forth to each other as part of supply chain operations. Benefits of e-business just in general terms, first and foremost, expanded marketing. So before the internet came about, companies had to rely on mostly word of mouth plus television, print, and kind of radio ads to attract customers and expand into new markets. As you can imagine, with the advent of the internet, it's much easier for companies to reach a much greater population of potential customer. So the opportunities for additional marketing and additional targeting of new customers are almost infinite. E-business can also help a company reduce its operating costs. If we can take certain manual functions that are kind of labor intensive, time intensive, and automate them through electronic means, we can certainly cut down on personnel costs, transaction costs, any other related costs. E-business can also help a company streamline operations. So really anything we can do to make a customer or employee's life easier falls under that umbrella of streamlining. So again, automating certain processes, maybe integrating our networks with our suppliers, those types of things would certainly be examples of that. And then faster, more efficient delivery of products and services. Again, if we're cutting out time in any delivery process by eliminating manual or repetitive steps, we're certainly making that process more efficient and shorter in duration. Costs associated with e-business include network setup costs. So buying the hardware, getting access to internet connections, high-speed internet connections, anything along those lines. There's a cost associated with the need for better controls. So anytime we expose ourselves to sensitive data loss or any kind of malicious behavior like that, we need to beef up the controls that would go around that. And there's a cost associated with that. There's also a cost associated with customer distrust, although that cost has certainly been decreasing kind of on a regular basis as more and more people get comfortable with transacting business over the internet. There's also a cost associated with technology breakdowns and service interruptions. So anytime we do move our business more online, we kind of run that risk that technology problems might make us look bad to our customers. I don't know if you've ever been out to a restaurant or wherever and tried to use a debit card to pay and have the employee tell you that their system is down right now and they can't take credit card payments and they'll have to kind of write your number down and do it later. There's certainly a cost associated with potential lost customers because of incidents like that. There are 5 e-business categories for us to consider, the first being business to consumer or B2C. Really talking here about any purchase you've made online from a company. Anytime you bought movie tickets or bought something from Amazon to have it shipped, anything like that's business to consumer. Business to business, B2B, we're talking about any business conducted between two businesses. So Dell and Lenovo, for example, make computer sales directly to other companies. So that's certainly business to business. Also things like Walmart's integration with their suppliers. So Walmart kind of makes their suppliers hook into their network to help them make the inventory replenishing process easier. And that's also an example of business to business. Government to consumer, or G to C, we're talking here about the IRS, maybe the DMV, any government body that's doing any kind of business with its constituents online. You interacting with UNC Charlotte could actually be considered government to business since we're a state school. We also have government to business. So IRS would come into play there again. Companies pay taxes as well, though probably not as much, right? But also things like the SEC or those regulatory bodies that require companies to make filings periodically. Those are all examples of government to business activity. And then consumer to consumer, also very prevalent for a lot of us. Things like eBay, Craigslist, any online classifieds. So that brings us to enterprise resource planning, or ERP systems. ERP systems in general are modular relational database systems that are designed to provide really integrated information for all of our decision making. So ERP systems, by modular, we mean there are certain pieces we can kind of chunk off and implement as needed. So the typical modules we'd find in an ERP system would include customer relationship management. Here we're talking about all of our customer information, demographic and contact information, also that customer's transaction history, their preferences for ordering, any referrals that we've gotten from them or to them. An HR module would include employee information, so employee demographics, all that employee history. We might even include things like performance and development history in there, their performance ratings for as long as they've been with the company, and so on. Supply chain module, that would include information for our vendors. Where do we find our vendors? What's our history with those vendors? What have we ordered from them, and so on. Financial management would encompass the entire AIS, so all of our accounting information, also our budgeting and forecasting reports and outputs that go along with that. And then another module might be project management. So how are we keeping track of kind of ongoing capital projects? And keep in mind that there's certain pieces of information, if you will, that could really fall under more than one of these modules. For example, under customer relationship, we said, oh, well, that would have their transaction history for customers. Well, certainly that transaction history would also generate accounting records, which would be found in the financial management module. So again, we're talking about how certain pieces of information would certainly be found in more than one module, if you will. PeopleSoft, which is now an Oracle-owned company, and SAP are really the industry leaders in ERP systems. There are others out there, but those are kind of the two market tigers. ERP implementation, as with any large-scale IT project, is difficult. There are some common causes of failure that, if we keep in mind, might lead to a little bit more in the way of success if we try to do one ourselves. First being poor leadership. Second, poor underlying business processes. So ERP or any IT solution should be the mechanism by which we execute a process. It should not be the process itself. So a lot of companies kind of fall into that trap of trying to use technology as the process rather than supplementing the process. And here's a good example of that. If we have poor underlying business processes, doesn't matter how good our ERP system is, it's not going to work. It's not going to be able to kind of patch up the holes in our processes. Unrealistic expectations. So again, if a company thinks that just plugging in an ERP system is going to magically make their processes work better, that's going to lead to unrealized expectations and eventually failure. Bad project management. So if we don't have good project management to see this thing from start to finish, the actual implementation of this thing, then it's certainly not going to be successful. Lack of training. If our employees don't know how to use it, and they don't know what they're expected to do with the system, then that's certainly not going to be a recipe for success. Mismatch between the ERP system and our overall structure or processes. So again, we should be fitting the system to our structure, not trying to fit our structure to the system. Bad data. Some of you are probably familiar with the phrase garbage in, garbage out. So if we have bad data to start with, the ERP system isn't going to magically clean that up and make it good data, right? We want to make sure our data is clean and effective before we ever plug this thing in. If we view our ERP implementation just as an IT project, just as a technology factor, then again, we're setting ourselves up for failure. We want to make sure we've considered all those underlying processes, the people that are going to be using it and interacting with those processes, and everything else as a whole. And then, of course, if we have insufficient hardware to host the system, or we experience other technical difficulties in implementation, then that's certainly going to lead to failure as well. Conditions for success for ERP implementation, some of these will feel fairly self-explanatory. So organizational commitment's the first one, and that starts at the top of the organization, of course. Does senior leadership support this effort? Do they emphasize the importance and the goals of this system from the very beginning? If they do, it's more likely to be a success. Clear communication, that's pretty much a key in anything we try to do in business, but certainly in a big project like an ERP implementation. So we need to make sure that everyone understands the goals of the system and also how their individual jobs fit in with this system. So they need to know how they're going to use it and in what ways they're going to use it. Again, if we view the ERP as an enterprise-wide venture and make sure we get everyone involved, not just technology functions, that's going to increase our chances of success. We also need to make sure we pick a compatible ERP system. So we talked about this in terms of failures. If the system doesn't fit our processes or can't fit our processes, then we're not likely to be successful. If we resolve multi-site issues ahead of time, that will increase our chances for success. And again, in terms of data, we need to make sure we have our data cleaned up and ready to go before we ever try to plug in this ERP system. Your textbook had a brief section on application service providers, ASP for short. So ASPs are third-party vendors that host some kind of packaged application. So we're really talking about providing software in a distributed environment as a service. So the use of an ASP is really a form of outsourcing. All we're doing is taking some function or some process that we could in theory do ourselves, and we're letting someone else who in theory is better at it do it, and we're paying them for that service. COSO also considers ASPs a form of risk sharing, right? The ASP takes on the risk of actually executing that process, and we still have an inherent risk in letting them execute that process. Common examples of ASPs are things like web hosting, email, transaction processing, maybe security functions from an IT perspective, and also some more complex processes like bookkeeping and payroll. A lot of you may have heard of the company Payroll Plus or seen the signs around. That's all they do, right, is process payroll. So companies pay that organization to take their payroll data, crank out payroll checks, put together the forms for paying payroll taxes, and so on. Benefits of using an ASP? Well, in theory, the cost should be lower. Again, if we're letting people who are good at that function and that's all they do, execute those processes, they can probably do it cheaper than we can do it in-house. Increased flexibility. If we're not wasting time on certain functions that aren't critical to us in terms of our operations, then we have a little more flexibility in those operations. Potential for customer service improvement. Again, we can get better if we have more time to devote to the customer, and we have more time to devote to the customer if we're spending less time doing things like payroll or processing our own data or anything else that we may be able to kind of push off to the ASPs. And then certainly continuity or disaster recovery benefits. So ASPs, if they're hosting our data, for example, they're another point of redundancy for us in storing that data. So should our site go down or should we kind of lose some data, we should be able to look to our third-party provider of data services to kind of help us restore that data. Some risks associated with using this type of service, certainly psychological factors. If employees see these functions being pushed to third parties, they might think it's a sign that their job is next to go. Service interruptions, not that we can't have service interruptions for our own processes, but if our ASP has downtime, that's kind of outside of our control. Compromised data, again, if we're passing our payroll data to the Payroll Plus folks, there's a chance that it might get intercepted. There's a chance that the Payroll Plus controls won't be kind of stringent enough to protect our data. We want to make sure we consider that before we use that type of service. And then contracts for service. The biggest consideration here is probably kind of that hostage holding situation where a company might rely on a third party to provide some service that becomes so critical that that third party can continue to raise prices, year after year and hold that company hostage for that service. ASPs were covered by SAS 70, which has been replaced by the Statement on Standards for Attestation Engagements number 16. We want to make sure that if we're considering using an ASP for any service, especially a critical service like payroll or data processing, that ASP has had some kind of service audit. So some third-party audit firm has come in there and said, yes, they're executing these processes appropriately, they're protecting their data adequately, and things along those lines. We want to make sure that someone can verify or vouch for this company before we consider letting them have access to our data. And now you should take a look at some of your practice questions in your textbook for further discussion in class.